On today's episode of Did Britain Do America a Favor? What role did Britain play in smoothing America's path to global hegemony? I'm the host. Britain is often described as America's oldest ally. It was the first country to recognize the United States after it declared independence from the British Empire in 1776. And throughout the 19th century, the two countries generally pursued similar foreign policies. They fought together against the Dutch in the War of 1812 and against Spain in the Spanish-American War. During World War I, they fought side by side against Germany, though that came at a cost for the U.S. as millions of American men were shipped across the Atlantic to fight in the European trenches where many died. And during World War II, they also fought on the same side again, with the U.S. initially sending aid and then troops to help defeat the Axis powers. But before we get to the wars, let's rewind back to the American Revolution itself. George III of Britain was not happy that his 13 American colonies had revolted and become their own country. He offered them a very generous peace deal that would have kept them part of the empire, but with some self-governing institutions. But the Americans rejected this offer and went on to win the war with the help of France, which had its own beef with Britain. So now let us fast forward through all those wars I just mentioned to the end of the 20th century when the Cold War finally came to an end. The Soviet Union had fallen apart, and the United States was left as the sole superpower in the world. It seemed like the American century was here at last. All this fighting Britain had done to help the U.S. become the world's dominant power didn't seem like much at the time. Even Britain didn't seem too bothered by the prospect of a new American-led world order. After all, it was about to join the European project and would be fine without the need to worry about international affairs anymore. However, things didn't really pan out that way. As while the United States has indeed become the sole global superpower, Britain has not exactly been fine. So if we take a step back and look at the bigger picture, we can see that Britain actually did America a huge favor by helping it become the world's sole superpower. And this is why. To understand how Britain helped make America the superpower it is today, we first need to understand what it was up against. If you've watched our videos on decolonization, then you already know that by the end of the 1940s, the British Empire was absolutely exhausted. It had fought a massive war, spent huge amounts of money and resources, and still ended up having to decolonize most of its holdings in Asia and Africa. This is why Britain never became a superpower itself, despite being one of the most powerful countries in the late 19th century. And to be fair, it probably wouldn't have wanted to be one anyway, as being a global power requires vast amounts of land and resources, something Britain no longer had after decades of decolonization. But back to America, which did have the land and resources to become a global power, but it lacked something else: global support. You see, despite being a major colonial power themselves, the Americans hadn't really done much in the way of nation building, especially in comparison to the British. This is why it hadn't really forged close ties with any other country before World War I, outside of maybe Canada and Mexico. However, as I just said, it did forge those close ties with Britain and France during the two world wars. And these relationships would serve it well, as after those wars ended, the U.S. was seen as a major player on the world stage. What America lacked, however, was a plan for what to do with this newfound status. It had entered both world wars reluctantly and without much of a plan. And it was only with the urging of figures such as George F. Kennan and many others that it decided to take on the mantle of global leadership. Britain had been the world's policeman since the 19th century, maintaining global trade routes and intervening in regional conflicts to keep things stable. America's vision for itself, however, was very different. As shown in our video on the origins of American exceptionalism, the country was founded on the belief that it was special, that its democracy and capitalism were superior to other forms of government and economy, and that its role in the world was to spread these ideals. This is why the U.S. under presidents like Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower focused so much on containing the spread of communism. It wasn't because it particularly liked or disliked the Soviet Union, but rather because it saw the Soviet attempt at communism as a threat to its own capitalist democracy. Had Britain still been a global power itself, it may have challenged this vision. But as I said, it was far too weak and far more interested in Europe than the rest of the world. This meant that America was free to pursue this vision without interference, allowing it to create a network of allies across the globe who shared its values and would ensure that it could project power into every corner of the earth. But Britain's influence over America can also be seen in the way America's foreign policy has evolved over time. Despite America's belief in its own exceptionalism, it has always had a soft spot for Britain. In fact, Winston Churchill once quipped that Americans will always forgive you if you are caught in Downing Street. This relationship has led to a close alliance between the two countries that has allowed the U.S. to smooth out many of its foreign policy issues. For example, when the U.S. went to war in Iraq in 2003, it was widely seen as an act of revenge for the 9/11 attacks, which had been planned on the soil of Afghanistan by al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden. However, Tony Blair's decision to join the war despite the lack of international support made it seem as though the Americans were less than reasonable. After all, they weren't acting alone. Another example of this can be seen in Northern Ireland. Despite the Good Friday Agreement being seen as a triumph of diplomacy, it was actually very controversial in that it essentially allowed a Catholic majority to rule over a Protestant minority. Such a thing would never have happened had the U.S. been involved from the start. But with Britain having skin in the game, the Americans were able to talk them around to accepting the agreement. Of course, Britain's impact on American foreign policy isn't always positive. Many scholars believe that Britain's close historical ties to Israel led the U.S. to become overly supportive of the state, even as its occupation of Palestine has become increasingly brutal. And Tony Blair's decision to join the Iraq War is seen by many as a huge mistake that destabilized the region. But overall, Britain's absence from the world stage after the mid-20th century gave America a clear path to global hegemony. With Britain unable to contest American foreign policy, America was able to build alliances, intervene in conflicts, and spread its influence across the globe without interference. And it was only after it had become the world's sole superpower that Britain was able to re-emerge onto the world stage, this time as America's closest ally. Of course, there are many other factors that contributed to America's rise to global power, including its geographic location, economic strength, military innovation, and cultural influence. But Britain's absence during the latter half of the 20th century cannot be understated. If Britain had remained a global power, it's likely that America would not have been able to establish its dominance so easily. And the world we live in today would almost certainly be very different. If you enjoyed this video, then be sure to check out our previous episode on how Britain gave away the world. Thanks for watching. America is by far the most powerful country in the world today. But it wasn't always this way. And its meteoric rise to the top only became possible after another great power stumbled. So why did Britain lose its global dominance, and how did that allow America to take over? When discussing the peak of any nation, we can loosely use their GDP as an indicator for their relative power on the global stage. If we look at GDP figures from 1870, we see that Britain was undoubtedly the most powerful economy in the world. It had pulled ahead of the rest of Europe quite some time ago, and was almost twice as powerful as the second-place economy of the United States. After all, the Industrial Revolution began here, and Britain became the first modern economic power with the largest and most efficient factories. This led to more innovation, which led to even more factory production, resulting in an exponential increase in wealth. The result was an economic powerhouse that was able to project its influence all around the world through superior military technology and naval power. At the time, there were very few countries that could realistically challenge Britain, and none that were even close. However, over the next century or so, we see a rather shocking reversal of fortunes. By 1970, the United States was far and away the most powerful economy in the world, boasting nearly double the GDP of its closest rival, Japan. In fact, no other developed nation came even close. West Germany was the next closest, but its economy was still less than half the size of America's. Today, America's lead has only increased, with it now boasting a GDP almost 3 times larger than its closest rival, China. It now dominates the global financial system, has unrivaled military capabilities, and exerts considerable soft power all across the planet. So what happened? Why is the USA so dominant and not Britain? It might be easy to assume that America simply did everything right while Britain did everything wrong. But the reality was much more complicated than that. Ultimately, Britain's demise was caused by multiple factors that took hold over a long period of time. However, perhaps the single most important factor was the opportunity cost created by Britain's colossal empire. You see, while Britain was once the dominant economic power, its position as such meant that it was also the most likely target for aspiring powers looking to depose it and take its crown. As such, Britain spent huge amounts of money maintaining its military and navy to ensure that its dominance was never challenged. Now, this strategy actually worked for quite some time. The Royal Navy was, without a doubt, the most powerful force on the seas for much of the 19th and early 20th centuries. The Navy was so large and so efficient that it allowed Britain to easily maintain its control over its massive empire. However, this came at an enormous cost. Every year, more money was being spent on maintaining the Navy than on the domestic economy. Now, to put this into perspective, in 1913, the Royal Navy's annual expenditure was equivalent to 28% of the UK government's total revenue. To make matters worse, this burden fell entirely on the British people. Britain was the only great power at the time that didn't have a conscript army, meaning it had to pay all of its soldiers and sailors. This meant that there was a constant pressure to increase taxes, which ultimately made living in Britain significantly more expensive than elsewhere. This, of course, caused many skilled workers and entrepreneurs to leave, seeking better opportunities abroad. Ironically, many of them moved to the United States, which caused America's rise and Britain's relative decline. To make things even worse, the 2 world wars nearly bankrupted Britain. It was already on the ropes before the First World War, but after all was said and done, it had lost nearly all of its wealth and global standing. It emerged from the Second World War deeply in debt and in no position to continue its role as the world's policeman. This finally allowed other powers like the USA to flex their muscles on the global stage. And with Britain out of the picture, there was no one to stop them. Another reason why Britain lost its dominance was because it failed to keep up with the latest innovations in weaponry. For much of the 19th century, Britain's navy dominated the seas because it used superior firepower to destroy enemy vessels. However, at the dawn of the 20th century, a new weapon was invented, the airplane. And this would soon change warfare forever. While Britain was the first to develop heavier-than-air-powered flight, this did not translate into a military advantage. You see, France and Germany were investing heavily in aviation technology, and by the start of the First World War, they had already developed effective fighter planes. This caught Britain off guard, but it wasn't alone. America had also been quietly developing its own aircraft industry. And when it entered the war, it quickly became the biggest supplier of aircraft to the British, giving them access to some of the most advanced planes in the conflict. While the British had focused on creating ever larger battleships, the Americans had focused on smaller, more maneuverable fighters. And as the 20th century wore on, this would prove to be a critical mistake. But these are just 2 of the reasons why Britain lost its dominance. There were plenty of others. Britain's colonial possessions increasingly became more costly to maintain, especially after the First World War when they gained independence. Additionally, Britain's population didn't grow anywhere near as fast as other nations, meaning that by the latter half of the 20th century, it simply didn't have enough people to support its economy, let alone fund its military. All of this culminated in the United Kingdom no longer being able to project its power across the world as it once did. So to answer the question posed in the title, Britain lost its global dominance because it got bogged down by its massive empire. which prevented it from investing in new technologies and making Britain itself a more prosperous place to live. Meanwhile, America was free to focus on growing its economy and military without the shackles of an enormous empire holding it back. Not to mention, America had a massive head start thanks to the inventions of the likes of Eli Whitney and later Henry Ford. These inventions caused American productivity to skyrocket, which in turn allowed it to build up a massive war machine. Before long, it was the leading manufacturer of weapons for the First World War, and by the Second World War, it was producing more tanks, ships and aircraft than the rest of the world combined. In many ways, Britain and America's fortunes were linked together. Britain's colossal empire eventually became too much for it to handle, but this created an opportunity for another power to rise in its place. America was the only nation with the resources and infrastructure to fill this void, and it did so with relative ease. Now it's worth noting that while the USA is undoubtedly the world's most powerful nation today, some argue that its position is nearly as strong as it was during the latter half of the 20th century. Its position as the world's preeminent power has been challenged by the rise of China, whose economy is roughly the same size as its own and is growing fast. We've also seen the emergence of a multipolar world with several major powers challenging the existing world order. On top of this, we're seeing the continued rise of Russia under Vladimir Putin and the resurgence of a Sino-Russian alliance, which may prove problematic for the USA in the years to come. Finally, the USA's political landscape has become increasingly divided, with polarization seemingly tearing the country apart. As such, some believe that America's best days are behind it and that its relative decline has already begun. While it's difficult to say whether this is true or not, it's undeniable that the world is changing. And it seems that America will have to adapt if it wants to maintain its position as the world's most powerful nation. As you can see, there are a lot of similarities between the relative decline of Britain and the current state of America. It seems that being the world's most powerful nation comes with certain burdens. When you're at the top, everyone else is gunning for you. And this means that you have to spend huge amounts of money on defense and protecting your interests, not to mention maintaining your military edge over potential adversaries. Additionally, the higher you climb, the fewer friends you tend to have. Sometimes being the most powerful nation means upsetting other nations and potentially causing them to form alliances against you. Right now, America faces opposition from China, Russia, Iran and North Korea, among others. And these nations are becoming increasingly close. Perhaps this is a sign that America's relative decline has already begun. Or perhaps it'll be able to weather this storm and remain the world's most powerful nation for decades to come. Only time will tell. If you enjoyed this video, please drop it a like and consider subscribing for more fun and informative content. Thanks for watching. When we talk about the end of British hegemony, it's easy to blame America for stealing Britain's crown. And while American leaders did play a role in this shift in power, that's only part of the story. The decline of Britain's global power was caused by many factors, but one of the biggest was Britain itself. So in today's video, we're gonna be looking at how Britain helped America replace them on the world stage. We'll be exploring for ways in which Britain aided America in becoming the new global hegemon economically, financially, technologically, and culturally. So stay tuned. At the end of World War II, the United States was emerging as a new superpower, flexing its military might with 2 atomic bombs and assuming a leading role in a new international order. But despite the US's best efforts, it couldn't have become the world's hegemon without Britain's help. And nowhere was this more apparent than in the economic sphere. At the end of World War II, Europe was in ruins and unable to project power on the world stage. This left a gaping hole in the global balance of power that the US and its allies were eager to fill. In 1947, the British economist John Maynard Keynes proposed the establishment of an international monetary fund and the World Bank to help finance the reconstruction of Europe and stabilize the global economy. These institutions would provide much-needed financial assistance to war-torn countries, helping them rebuild their economies and resume their place in the global trading system. However, the U.S. rejected Keynes' plan and instead launched its own initiative called the Marshall Plan. This initiative would provide over $12 billion in aid to Western European countries, helping them to rebuild their economies and strengthen their ties to the United States. The Marshall Plan proved to be highly successful in achieving its goals, contributing significantly to the economic recovery of Western Europe and cementing the region as a bulwark against communism. For instance, between 1948 and 1952, industrial production in Western Europe increased by over 100%, and the region became increasingly integrated through the formation of economic organizations such as the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And then there's the fact that the U.S. leveraged Britain's colonial holdings to further its own economic interests. You see, the U.S. saw the vast resources of the British Empire as an opportunity to expand its own economic influence around the world. They supported the continued existence of the empire long enough to benefit from it, even as they pressured Britain to grant independence to its colonies. For example, in 1947, the U.S. encouraged India to gain independence from the British Raj, which it did. But soon after, Britain and India signed a trade agreement that allowed British companies to continue exploiting India's vast resources. Similarly, the U.S. supported the independence of other British colonies such as Ghana in 1957 and Nigeria in 1960, while at the same time encouraging them to maintain close economic ties with Britain. By leveraging Britain's colonial holdings, the U.S. was able to expand its economic influence into new markets and secure access to valuable resources without having to invest heavily in infrastructure or engage in costly military conflicts. This strategy proved highly effective in expanding American capitalism around the world. Despite being the richest country in the world, the United States lacked a crucial component of global hegemony, a strong alliance system. And so it turned to Britain to help establish the bedrock of its Cold War alliances. The relationship between the two countries dates back to the American Revolution, when Britain's former colony sought to assert its independence on the world stage. Despite the turbulent history between the two nations, both countries recognized the need to cooperate in the face of new challenges brought on by the Cold War. The alliance between the two countries was formalized in 1941 when they signed the Atlantic Charter, outlining their shared commitment to democracy, freedom, and international cooperation. This partnership was solidified further with the creation of NATO in 1949, a military alliance that bound together North America and Western Europe against the threat of Soviet aggression. But the alliance between Britain and America went beyond just military cooperation. Both countries also engaged in extensive people-to-people exchanges, promoting cultural understanding and cooperation in areas such as education, science, and technology. One of the most significant examples of this was the Fulbright program, which was established in 1946 to promote mutual understanding between the United States and the United Kingdom. This program has provided thousands of opportunities for students, scholars, and professionals to study, research, and work in each other's countries. Such exchanges have helped to build a lasting legacy of friendship and cooperation between the two nations, which contributed to the broader Western alliance system that the United States has built up during the Cold War. However, as time went on, Britain's contributions to the alliance system became less significant due to its declining global power and the rise of other American allies such as France, Germany, and Japan. Despite this shift, the legacy of the Anglo-American alliance continues to shape the relationship between the two countries and their cooperation on issues of mutual interest. The alliance was not just important for containing the Soviets, but it was also crucial in projecting American power on the globe. The U.S. military bases in Britain provided a strategic advantage, allowing the U.S. to quickly deploy troops and resources to various parts of the world. For example, during the Korean War, Britain provided airfields and ports to the U.S. military, allowing them to transport troops and supplies to the Korean peninsula quickly. This support was crucial in helping the UN forces, which were primarily American, to fight the North Koreans and Chinese. Additionally, the alliance allowed the U.S. to maintain a strong military presence in Europe throughout the Cold War, deterring any potential Soviet aggression. For instance, the US maintained nuclear missiles in Britain during the 1960s, which served as a warning to the Soviets of the potential consequences of an attack on Western Europe. This military cooperation extended beyond the Cold War as well. For example, the US and Britain collaborated on numerous joint military exercises, allowing both countries to improve their military capabilities and interoperability. One notable example is the Baltops exercise conducted in 1982, which involved a simulated attack on an invading force and helped both militaries to refine their strategies and tactics. Much like the economic realm, American military power wouldn't have been possible without first having British approval. The Royal Navy had dominated the seas since the Age of Exploration, and their naval supremacy ensured that American ships could safely traverse the oceans unchallenged. Without this protection, it would have been difficult for the U.S. to project its military power around the world and enforce its foreign policy objectives. Furthermore, the British Empire's vast network of military bases and coaling stations provided logistical support for the American Navy, allowing them to refuel and resupply their ships during long voyages. For example, the U.S. Navy used British naval bases in the Mediterranean Sea to support its operations during the early stages of the Second World War. However, the transfer of power from Britain to America was not always smooth. During the Cold War, the U.S. and Britain sometimes had conflicting interests, which caused tension in their relationship. For example, the U.S. strongly opposed the British decision to maintain close ties with the apartheid regime in South Africa, seeing it as a threat to the broader anti-colonial movement in Africa. Despite these tensions, the alliance between the two countries endured, demonstrating the importance of their partnership in maintaining global stability. Nevertheless, the changing global political landscape and the emergence of new challenges, such as terrorism and climate change, have led to a redefinition of the relationship between the two countries in the 21st century. While the alliance remains strong, the future of the relationship will depend on their ability to adapt to these new challenges and find common ground on issues of mutual interest. It's hard to imagine America becoming the world's hegemon without the crucial contributions of Britain. From helping to rebuild Europe after World War II to providing military support during the Cold War and sharing intelligence about the Soviet Union, Britain played a crucial role in securing America's position on the world stage. But the relationship between these two countries goes back even further than that. It was the partnership forged between them during World War II that laid the foundation for the post-war order and ultimately made the transfer of power from Britain to America. Did you know that Britain made deals with 3 countries before the American Revolution? These deals are often forgotten, but were crucial in America's path to becoming a global power. In this video, we will discuss what these agreements were and how they impacted the development of the United States. Welcome to my channel, a place where you can learn about history in a fun and engaging way. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of our awesome videos. The first country Britain made a deal with was Spain. In 1776, when the American Revolution began, Spain was still reeling from the loss of their empire in North America. They had lost Florida to the British in 1763 after the 7 Years' War and were angry that Britain had not returned the valuable Bahamas as agreed upon in the treaty. Despite this, Spain entered into a secret alliance with France, who also had territorial disputes with Britain, as well as being humiliated by their defeat in the previous war. This alliance included military cooperation and mutual support in case of conflict. In 1779, Spain declared war on Britain due to their unresolved territorial disputes and joined the conflict between Britain and America. While the conflict raged in North America, Spain sent troops to capture the Bahamas from the British as agreed upon in the alliance. However, they faced stiff resistance from the British, who had fortified the islands. The Spanish campaign in the Bahamas was ultimately a failure. The British governor of Jamaica refused to surrender the Bahamas. The Spanish forces struggled to gain a foothold on the islands and eventually retreated back to Cuba. Spain's entry into the war caused some problems for the Americans. At first, Spain seemed like a great ally to have on their side, and they were. But the problem was that Spain wasn't exactly trustworthy. For example, when Spain retook control of West Florida, which had been seized by the British, they kept it despite the fact that it was supposed to be returned to Britain according to the Treaty of Par. That ended the war. Despite the problems, Spain played an important role in securing American independence. By joining the war, Spain tied down a significant number of British troops in North America, which relieved pressure on the Americans. Spain also provided the Americans with much-needed supplies and financial aid, which helped them to sustain the war effort. Additionally, Spain's navy was a formidable force at sea, and its presence in the Caribbean disrupted British trade routes. This, in turn, weakened the British economy and made it more difficult for Britain to support the war in America. The second country Britain made a deal with was Portugal. Portugal's alliance with Britain during the American Revolution was primarily driven by self-interest rather than any ideological affinity between the two nations. Portugal was a maritime trading power with vast colonial holdings in South America and Asia. However, their trading interests were constantly under threat from the Dutch, who had recently captured several Portuguese colonial possessions. To counter the Dutch threat, Portugal sought an alliance with Britain, which would provide them with much-needed naval support. In 1777, Portugal signed a defensive alliance with Britain, agreeing to provide the British with 2,000 troops and a small navy for use in the war. However, Portugal's contribution to the war effort was limited. Most of the troops they provided to the British were used in garrison duty in places like Nova Scotia, and their navy saw little action against the Americans. This was because Portugal was primarily interested in protecting their own colonial interests, and they were wary of committing too many resources to the conflict in North America. Nonetheless, Portugal's alliance with Britain was a significant one, as it demonstrated that the war was not simply a conflict between two European powers and their colonies, but was in fact a wider international conflict with global implications. In addition to providing military support, Portugal also allowed British ships to use their ports and provided intelligence on Dutch activities in South America. Despite the limited military contribution, Portugal's alliance with Britain during the American Revolution had a significant impact on the outcome of the war. First, it tied up a significant number of Portuguese troops in North America, which reduced the number of troops available to defend Portuguese colonial holdings in South America. Second, it forced the Dutch to divert resources away from their war effort in America in order to protect their colonial possessions in Asia and South America. Third, the alliance with Britain gave Portugal access to a powerful navy, which helped to protect their trading ships and coastal cities from attack. Finally, the alliance with Britain demonstrated that the war in America was not just a conflict between two European powers and their colonies, but was part of a wider international struggle for colonial supremacy. The third country Britain made a deal with was Prussia. Frederick the Great of Prussia was a major proponent of the alliance between his nation and Britain. He was an absolute monarch who ruled over the Kingdom of Prussia with an iron fist. Despite this, he was a champion of Enlightenment ideals and was a patron of the arts and sciences. He was also a military genius and is considered to be one of the greatest generals in history. Frederick the Great's decision to enter into an alliance with Britain was primarily driven by his desire to secure the eastern frontier of his kingdom. He had long been at odds with his neighbors, the Habsburg Austrians, and he feared that they might take advantage of a war between Britain and America to invade his territory. An alliance with Britain would help to deter the Austrians and would also provide Prussia with access to British naval power. However, while Frederick the Great was eager to enter into an alliance with Britain, the same could not be said for the British government. They were hesitant to commit themselves to a conflict in Europe and were concerned that an alliance with Prussia would drag them into a wider European war. Despite these concerns, the alliance was eventually signed in 1778. While Prussia did not provide any direct military support to the British during the war, Frederick the Great did make efforts to prevent other European powers from coming to the aid of the Americans. For example, he successfully negotiated a peace treaty between Russia and Sweden, which prevented those powers from sending troops to America. In addition, he also kept the Habsburg Austrians out of the war. The alliance between Prussia and Britain was short-lived and was terminated in 1783 with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. Despite this, it was an important one as it demonstrated that the American Revolution was not simply a conflict between two colonial powers, but was part of a wider struggle for global supremacy. So why was it important for Britain to have allies during the American Revolution? The simple answer is that it helped them to win the war. The presence of foreign troops and supplies made a significant difference on the battlefield. In addition, having allies demonstrated that the war was not simply a conflict between two colonial powers, but was part of a wider international struggle for global supremacy. This had several important consequences. First, it made it more difficult for the Americans to obtain supplies and reinforcements from abroad. Second, it tied down a significant number of troops in North America, which reduced the number of troops available to fight against the Americans. Third, it demonstrated that the war in America was not simply a conflict between two colonial powers, but was part of a wider international struggle for global supremacy. Fourth, it forced the Dutch to divert resources away from their war effort in America in order to defend their colonial possessions in South America and Asia. Finally, it gave Portugal access to a powerful navy, which helped to protect their trading ships and coastal cities from attack. Which of these alliances do you think was the most important and why? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please hit the like button and share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on any of our future videos. Thanks for watching.